So this next panel is going to take a more historical approach and look back into the past for some concepts to possibly help us think about this issue today, or at least understand from where we arrived at our current theoretical and conceptual understandings of civil relations. And the first up is going to be Mitt Regan, who's the McDevitt Professor of Jurisprudence and co-director of the Center for the Study of the Legal Profession at Georgetown University Law School. And he is the author of many works on ethical issues, especially within organizations. But most dear to my heart, he's been the ethics chair this year, and he's been fantastic, and I thank him for that. I'll introduce all three people now, and we'll start with Mitt. Second up will be Dr. Hugh Liebert, Assistant Professor of American Politics at the Department of Social Sciences at West Point. And he is the author recently, Cambridge University Press, of Plutarch's Politics, which won an award for its excellence. So thank you for joining us, Hugh. And then finally, Dr. Jeff Black, who received his PhD in political theory and international relations at Boston College, and he teaches at St. John's College as a tutor, parentheses, professor. And he came to us as a fellow, really very happy to have him this year. Prior to coming to us, he was the Associate Dean for the graduate program at St. John's. So thank all of you for joining us, and Mitt, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ed. I want to start by thanking the Stockdale Center for putting on such a terrific event year after year. Colonel Athens, who is, dare I say, an inspirational leader, and Colonel Barrett as well, who's just a wonderful colleague over the course of the semester. Also want to thank Marge Bem and Jackie Dana for the wonderful work they do at the center as well, which has certainly made my life much easier. I want to discuss the concerns of the framers of the U.S. Constitution about civil-military relations, why they regarded a standing professional army as a potential threat to Republican government, and why their concerns may be relevant today, not with respect to a professional military, but with what some have regarded as the growing militarization of local police forces. So the founders were keen students of history. Their reading of the experiences with Caesar, Oliver Cromwell, King George III, all led them to fear that a ruler with a professional army could undermine civil liberties in a republican form of government. For Adams and Jefferson, for instance, they took from the new model army of Oliver Cromwell this lesson: composed of officers from the aristocracy and soldiers from the bottom of society, brutalized by harsh discipline, isolated from the rest of society, loyal not to an ideal or a government, but to a commander and its own traditions. Such people were more likely to identify with the rulers than with their fellow citizens, and not to value democratic values of political participation and deliberation. Madison also expressed concern about soldiers who were socialized by military experience and divorced from the daily life of ordinary citizens. The bulwark against such potential oppression for the founders was the citizen soldier, the militia. The citizen soldier would be willing to use force, but only in answering the call to preserve the liberties of those who resisted attempted oppression by the government. He was not a professional soldier whose orientation reflected immersion in permanent military service, but someone who was deeply immersed in the community. This meant he valued its liberties and would not become the instrument of power of those who sought to undermine them. This citizen soldier's identity of interest with the general population provided reassurance that he would not use his weapons against his fellow citizens. As one founder wrote, "What shadow of danger can there be from men who are daily mingling with the rest of their countrymen and who participate with them in the same feelings, sentiments, habits, and interests?" Right? The direct experience of colonists reinforced the founders' concerns about a standing professional military. As Alexander Hamilton put it, the people of America may be said to have derived a hereditary impression of danger to liberty from standing armies in time of peace. By the Revolutionary period, thousands of British soldiers were stationed in the colonies. They were quartered in private homes, they clashed repeatedly with colonists, sometimes looted and destroyed property, and of course eventually killed 5 citizens in the Boston Massacre. In May of 1774, General Thomas Gage was appointed both governor of Massachusetts as well as commander-in-chief of the British Army in North America. The result on the part of the colonists, they feared, was that military power was going to be used by the Crown to suppress their liberties. And numerous colonies reorganized their militia to be ready to resist this. Right? They directed their colonial militia units with due deliberation and patriotic regard for the public service to elect their own company officers. Those chosen in local voting were to elect regimental officers. The provincial Congress retained the power to appoint general officers. As Lawrence Kress has observed, the reorganization of the militia in response to the arrival of General Gage represented a mobilization of the same independent citizenry that had been the foundation of the classical Republican Army. Now, the founders sought to implement their conception of civil-military relations in the Constitution. They acknowledged the need for some standing army, although at the time the Revolutionary War ended and the Articles of Confederation were still in place, they had reduced the size of the army to 700 people. The founders assumed that the primary defense of the United States would be provided by the state militia, who would be called up when needed, federalized, at least initially by Congress, who then delegated the power ultimately to the president, right? So in the Constitution, Congress is provided authority to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia and for governing them insofar as they're employed in federal service. The states, however, are given the authority to appoint officers and to train the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. The executive thus has no ability to appoint officers of the military, of the militia, reducing his ability to use them for his own purposes. With respect to a standing army, Congress is limited to authorizing expenditures for this for no longer than 2 years. It's in the Constitution. Furthermore, Congress, not the President, is authorized to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. So as one Continental Army officer put it, contrasting the incipient American system with the British, there the armies are the monarch's armies. Their direction is solely by him without any control. Here the army is the army of the people. It is they who raise and pay them. It is they who judge the necessity of the measure. It is, therefore, our army, the civilian militia. Persistent concern about a standing army led to a tradition of limiting military involvement in domestic law enforcement. Many of you are probably familiar with the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which says, whoever, except in cases and under circumstances expressly authorized by the Constitution or Act of Congress, willfully uses any part of the Army or Air Force as a Posse Comitatus or otherwise to execute the laws is subject to fine and imprisonment. And of course, that's been extended to the Navy as well. Congress in recent years has authorized an increasing number of exceptions to the deployment of the military for domestic law enforcement, but I think it's accurate to say the professional military has internalized the idea deeply of subordination to civilian authority. When it's called upon to intervene in a law enforcement context, it does so only reluctantly, and it does so with great restraint. All right? So the founders' concerns that a professional army would somehow represent a threat to citizens' everyday liberties has not materialized. I think it's a great credit to our military, and to the evolution of our country. But I think it's worth considering whether the perception of a more substantial threat may be emerging in the form of an institution that didn't exist at the time of the founders, which is the local police forces. Right? Police, obviously, are the citizens who are charged even more directly with protection of the community than the state militia. Ideally, they're deeply embedded in the community that they serve. They're averse to using force against members of the community unless they need to. In this sense, they ideally see themselves as the founders imagined the state militia, citizens who would use force to protect rather than subdue the community. Right? There is a trend, however, toward what many have called the militarization of the police. This involves the use of both weapons and tactics closely associated with the professional military. In some cases, it may involve a more adversarial orientation of the relationship between the police and the military. So let me just give you some figures. Paramilitary police raids in the U.S. In 1980 were 3,000. In 2001, they had increased to 45,000. Minneapolis police conducted 36 SWAT team raids in 1987 and more than 700 in 1996. The percentage of cities of 50,000 or more with SWAT teams in 1982 was 59%. In 1995, it was 89%. The percentage of towns between 25,000 and 50,000 with a SWAT team increased from 25% in 1984 to 80% in 2005. Congressional legislation has authorized a program in which the Department of Defense provides military equipment to local law enforcement forces. The Department of Homeland Security has provided a grant program in addition that complements that. And as of 2014, 8,000 local law enforcement agencies participated in the program to the tune of a little over $5 billion since its inception in 1997. Since 1997, more than 600 mine-resistant ambush-protected MRAPs, right, have been sent to law enforcement agencies in almost every state in the United States. More than 79,000 assault rifles, 205 grenade launchers, almost 500 bomb detonator robots, 422 airplanes and helicopters. Police in Watertown, Connecticut recently acquired an MRAP, although there's never been a landmine in Watertown, Connecticut, which has a population of 22,000. Police in Bloomington, Georgia, which has a population of about 2,500, recently acquired 4 grenade launchers through the program. Keene, New Hampshire, population 23,000, received a grant to purchase an 8-ton armored personnel vehicle, even though Keene, New Hampshire, in the last 12 years has had a total of 2 murders. The county, including Columbia, South Carolina, bought an M113A1 armored personnel carrier that moves on tank-like tracks and has a belt-fed turreted machine gun that fires 50 caliber bullets. Right? As one former New York police officer said in an op-ed, the police culture in our country has changed. An emphasis on officer safety and paramilitary training pervades today's policing in contrast to the older culture. Right? So the concerns that the founders had about the standing army, again, I think are now not embodied in our professional military. But we need, I think, at least to pay attention to the possibility that a militarized local law enforcement may begin to pose this threat, or at least be perceived in members of the community, by members of the community in that way. We need to ask whether a greater military orientation among local police has eroded the identification with the community, right? This is a particular concern because, unlike the military, of course, local police forces have an intimate daily presence in their communities. They are supposed to use lethal force only as a last resort, when, of course, the military is authorized to do so as a first resort, and if they begin to think of themselves as warriors, as members of the military, this may subtly change their calculus. The military has a deep appreciation of the gravity and limits of the use of violence, right? But what we may be seeing is an example perhaps of what Mr. Fallows mentioned, which is there is sort of an adulation of the military without understanding it. There is a glamorization of violence, right, without appreciating the very measured way in which the military looks at violence. Now, I'm talking in very general terms here. I'm painting with a broad brush. But there is an unmistakable trend that I've described. And we all know that once you've got weapons, you want to use them, right? I don't know what Keene, New Hampshire is going to do with its armored personnel carrier, but it's going to find some use for it, right? So I think in closing, we need to consider whether our shift, it makes sense to shift our attention. That is, that the founders' underlying concerns may still be salient, but they were wrong about the danger that a standing military posed. The question I think that we need to ask ourselves, at least keep an eye on, is whether a militarized police force may be emerging that is the current embodiment of those concerns. So now let me introduce Dr. Liebert.
Thanks. So first off, thanks for having me at this great conference. I've really enjoyed it so far. So for the past several, sorry. Got it. Okay. For the past several years, I've been teaching a course at West Point on civil-military relations and the history of political philosophy. Political philosophy is my home discipline, and civil-military relations is a kind of vacation home that I'm still settling into. It's a field that civilians at West Point discover very quickly if they haven't encountered it before. And it's a really fascinating field for a number of reasons. Probably the first that struck me is how contemporary and how ancient the central question of civ-mil is. And I should say the central question, as I understand it, is how societies can defend themselves against enemies using a military that can also be used to oppress citizens at home. That's a very contemporary question, right? There's always some new coup or some new controversy to think about. But it's also a very ancient question. In fact, it's arguably one of the most ancient questions in our tradition of political thought. And it's one that virtually every political philosopher, every canonical political philosopher anyhow, has something to say about until well up into the 19th century. So I think despite that fact, not a whole lot of contemporary political philosophers study this aspect of their tradition, with some honorable exceptions. And that's true with civil military scholars too. Again, with some exceptions, there's not so much attention to this. And as just evidence of that, I'll read from the Old Testament of civ-mil, Huntington, who says that the activities of the Praetorian Guard offer few useful lessons for civilian control. The cleavage between the military and civilian spheres and the resulting tension between the two are phenomena of distinctly recent origin. So I think this kind of mutual neglect is bad for both political philosophy and civ-mil. So I'm going to try here to very quickly build a bridge between these two disciplines, or given the time constraints, at least gesture to where someone else could build a bridge if they wanted to. I'm going to start by talking about what political philosophy is, and then I'm going to say something about how one of the fundamental problems that political philosophers study, the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns, is to a considerable degree a dispute about how to understand civil-military relations. Okay. So first, what is political philosophy? This question is more difficult to answer than it should be because political philosophers today don't really agree about the basic definition of their field. Some take their bearings from the original meaning of the word political philosophy. They say that political philosophy is fundamentally the love of wisdom of politics. Like the ancients, they take politics to mean the collective pursuit of the good life. And so they understand by political philosophy the pursuit of knowledge of the human good, understood as a way of life that would be best for human beings as human beings, best always and everywhere. Studying the history of political thought is important from that perspective because it's possible that some earlier philosopher got it right, and so might be able to teach us how to live in the present. A second group of scholars thinks that we can't know the human good in the sense of knowing a way of life that would be best for human beings as human beings. The most we can know about the good is what people believe the good to be, as we can study opinions or values. That perspective also opens up into a version of the history of political thought, because we can study the development of values over time. We might notice, for instance, that early in the 17th century, every intelligent man and woman thought monarchy was the best regime. But by the late 19th, early 20th century, most intelligent men and women thought democracy was the best regime. How did that happen? Right? We can look at texts where men and women justify their opinions. We can study how the kind of strategies of justification change over time. And we can tell a story about that without really ever settling the question of whether monarchy or democracy is in fact the best regime. Okay. So those are two very different conceptions of political philosophy, and they each produce a distinct approach to the history of political thought. They also, to the extent that political philosophers get into this topic, offer distinct approaches to civil-military relations. Among those who think the human good is knowable, some scholars study the virtue that the military lays special claim to, courage, which in Greek is andreia, literally manliness. They ask what it is. Is it the consummate virtue, as some claim? And if not, what's the role of courage in the good life? Among those who say that all we can know is values, there's a group of scholars who have discovered a tradition of republican thought, running from Aristotle to Cicero to Machiavelli to the English Republicans of the 17th century, and ultimately up into the period of the American founding. This tradition, they say, says that liberty is secured and practiced by participation in politics and armed service. So with that rough sketch of contemporary political philosophy in view, what can we say that a political philosophical approach to civ mil might add to social science discussions of that topic? I think we can identify two main areas where political philosophy has something to contribute. First, approaching civ mil through political philosophy widens our historical lens considerably, either because there's some trans-historical essence of civil-military relations, or because the tradition that informs our understanding of civ mil has been quite long in the making, in some sense reaching back to Aristotle. Second, I think political philosophy offers a slightly different approach to normative issues in civ mil. Social scientific approaches tend to assume that normative issues are fairly straightforward in this field. To use Huntington as an example again, the difference between the functional and the societal imperatives. Huntington says it's good for the military to be effective, and it's good for the military not to threaten our regime. The tradition of political philosophy highlights a number of other goods that we might consider when thinking about this relationship. Among them, education, citizenship, virtue, responsibility, and liberty. So you can conceivably, I think, make the case that you could sacrifice some element of military effectiveness or some other good for one of these goods that political philosophy adds. And perhaps even more importantly than that, political philosophy, because it involves the analysis and rational argument about values, teaches us, I think, in a way different anyway than contemporary social science, how to think about some of the normative judgments we have to make in civ mil. How exactly do you determine how much military effectiveness is worth a degree of civilian control? This is a very hard question. It's a question that statesmen have to answer all the time, but social science, insofar as it is a kind of value-neutral, empirical science, doesn't offer them a whole lot of help in making that kind of judgment. Political philosophy, which is a form of pursuing knowledge about politics, more attuned to those normative issues, I think can stand to help there. So that's what I think political philosophical approaches have to offer to civ mil. I want to turn now from telling to showing and say something about how ancient and modern political philosophers differed over how to think about civil-military relations. Okay, so this is part two, civil-military relations, ancient and modern. Plato's Republic is the founding text of Western political thought and civil-military relations. The two disciplines are joined in the womb. It's Plato who first poses the central question of civ mil, who shall guard the guardians. Plato can put that question in the first place because he thinks of the guardians as distinct from the normal run of individuals. Plato's guardian, like Huntington's officer, is an expert in violence. And here I'm quoting, "Will a man, if he picks up a shield or any other weapon or tool of war, on that very day be an adequate combatant in a battle of heavy armed soldiers?" That's not the case in any other human endeavor, and it certainly is not the case with the, quote, art of war, end quote. And I should mention here that the passage I'm quoting from in the Republic is also the first place in our traditional political thought where the term art of war, polemiche, is used. Right, so it's an interesting thing to notice that both political philosophy and civ mil, but also the art of war, are invented at the same time. They're kind of identified and named at the same time. Okay, and so Plato sets the soldiers in his best regime apart from the rest of the city, by virtue not only of their training, but their nature. The guardian must be keen, quick, strong. Above all, he must be spirited. Already in Plato's Republic, then, we have Mill distinguished from Civ, both in expertise and in soul, what Huntington would call the military mind. And we have the question of how the military, conceived in that way, can be restrained from using its expertise in violence against fellow citizens. With all respect for Huntington, the cleavage between the military and civilian spheres and the resulting tension between the two are very clearly, I think, not phenomena of distinctly recent origin. What should make Plato interesting to us, though, isn't what he anticipates in our own way of thinking about civ mil, but what he adds to it. When Plato wonders whether a power strong enough to protect the regime from its enemies might also harm the regime at home, he worries not only about civic institutions, but about human nature. Plato places at the center of his reflections on civ mil not an economic or technological revolution, but a philosophical question. Is it possible for man in his pride to acquire expertise in the management of violence without aspiring to tyranny? His answer to that is yes, but the conditions for saying yes are so peculiar that it leaves us wondering what exactly to make of his answer. His solution to the problem turns on education, broadly understood to involve how we speak about the gods, heroes, even animals. Not to put too fine a point on it, but for Plato, the key question in civ mil is how institutions like West Point and the Naval Academy are set up to educate the guardians. For Greek readers, and probably for us too, the proper kind of education involves something like a cultural revolution, right? So Plato has to revise all of Homer in order to get it right. The closest equivalent for us would be, very vigorously censoring pop culture, I think, which at least at West Point doesn't happen. Maybe the Naval Academy is different. So in addition to that, there are all these peculiar institutions about banishing privacy, houses and families, and so on. But education is really the key. The guardians are provided, Plato says, with the greatest safeguard against their turning into tyrants if they have been really finely educated. Ultimately, education guards the guardians. But if a fine education is as demanding as Plato suggests, you might ask whether it's really possible for any regime to guard itself from guardians. Now, Plato ultimately entrusts his best regime not to guardians, but to the ultimate civilians, philosophers. As in the soul, reason is supposed to govern spirit, so in the city, the civilian in its highest form should be separate from and superior to the military. The philosopher's rule is justified because for Plato, nature is a realm of ideas oriented ultimately by a single principle, the good or the idea of the good. For Plato, man at his peak wants not to overcome nature, but to contemplate it. Not to conquer like Homer's warriors, but merely to contemplate and comprehend. Plato invents the art of war in the course of subordinating war to philosophy. To conceive of war as an art, one object of knowledge among many, seems almost necessarily to entail subordinating that art to philosophy, or knowledge of the whole within which the art of war is merely a part. Now, Machiavelli launches the most profound and influential critique of Plato's view of civil-military relations, at the same time that it departs from Plato's view of political philosophy. The clear statement of that difference occurs in a famous passage of The Prince. He says, "Since my intent is to write something useful to whoever understands it, it has appeared to me more fitting to go directly to the effectual truth of the thing rather than the imagination of it." That passage offers a critique of both Plato's moralism and Plato's view of philosophy. On Machiavelli's understanding, Plato suggested that the best way of life is one oriented not by action in the world, but by contemplation of nature's order, which Plato understood to be truer than what we saw around us in the physical world. Machiavelli contemptuously calls that imagination, using a term we reserve for mental images that aren't necessarily true and probably false. When one imagines, Machiavelli says, one is ruined. So what everyone said before Machiavelli you should do, in fact, inhibits human flourishing. Nature is not ordered in such a way as to guarantee human happiness no matter what happens in the physical world. So we have to begin again from the effectual truth rather than the imagination of things. In a certain sense, Machiavelli then returns to Homer. War is made central to his view of human happiness, as it was in Homer but wasn't in Plato. However, Machiavelli departs from Homer and follows Plato in portraying war as an art. War is something that can be studied, practiced, and perfected. The art of war, for Machiavelli, in fact, becomes the consummate art. And thus we find in Machiavelli arguments foreign to both Homer and Plato, as for instance when Machiavelli says that where you have good arms, you must have good laws, and when he says that a prince should have no other object, nor any other thought, nor take anything else as his art, but that of war and its orders and discipline. For that is the only art which is of concern to one who commands. In these passages, and in general in Machiavelli, the art of war is set free from the constraints that Plato put it under. Warriors are no longer subordinate to philosopher kings. They've led a coup and now rule the city. Or perhaps it's better to say that the warrior's art, the art of war, has been shown to be all-inclusive, and thus to make philosophy subordinate to it, rather than the other way around. In the most fundamental sense, Mill rightly rules civ. Machiavelli's politics correspond to that insight. But this doesn't stop Machiavelli from conceiving of a way for civilians to control the military. He says that it's very difficult in a principality. The prince has to become a captain, basically, if he doesn't want to be overthrown by one of his captains. But in a republic, it's possible for civilians to maintain something that would look to us like civilian control. Machiavelli describes two ways in particular that the Roman Republic achieved that goal. First, multiplying the number of captains so that the mill kept itself in check. We would say the principal should divide the agent in order to control the agent. Second, keeping commands and terms of service so short that soldiers understood as their arts, civilian arts like farming, rather than the military art. Even when republics, by using techniques like these, maintained a semblance of civilian control, it was secured only ultimately by the art of war, knowledge of how to turn to your own purposes, an element that's foreign and hostile to you. Like Plato, Machiavelli's fundamental orientation towards what is beyond human power, call it nature or God or fortune, coincides with his approach to the question of civil-military relations. All right. So the American regime, I think, is heir to both of those different traditions, but we've already heard a lot about that. So I'm just going to wrap up really quickly by drawing one very broad conclusion from that brief attempt to bridge political philosophy and Civ Mill. We find in Plato, I think, certain anticipations of Huntington's idea of professionalism. And we find in Machiavelli some anticipations of Peter Fever's and others' more hard-headed, realistic theory of how Civ controls Mill. But we also find something new in these political philosophers. It seems these basic ways we think about Civ Mill are not merely our inheritance from the 19th century or kind of consequences of our commitment to democratic theory. The political philosophers I've discussed suggest that our understanding of man's nature, and indeed man's position with respect to nature writ large, is reflected in how we approach the problem of civil-military relations. Civ Mill is a much more difficult and important problem, I think, than political philosophers and social scientists understand when they work in isolation from one another. Thanks.
Thanks for having me. I'm also a political philosopher by training, so some of this will sound familiar. Students of civil-military relations know there is a world elsewhere in the great books of the history of Western political thought. But our way back to this world is blocked by a giant of civil-military relations theory. Describing the rise of military professionalism in the soldier and the state, Samuel P. Huntington writes, "It is possible to speak of the issues of civilian control, militarism, and the military mind as existing prior to 1800. But the fundamental transformation in the first part of the 19th century makes it relatively profitless to go back before that time in search of light on modern problems. The cleavage between the military and civilian spheres and the resulting tension between the two are phenomena of distinctly recent origin." This verdict would have surprised the Roman Caius Marcius, the hero of Shakespeare's tragedy Coriolanus, who is said to have lived, fought, and died more than 2,000 years before the rise of professionalism caused Huntington's fundamental transformation. Coriolanus' story can be quickly told. He is a Roman nobleman who becomes famous for martial valor, while the Republic is torn by strife between the nobles and the people over food, debt, and military service. When the Volscians, a nearby people, declare war on Rome, he sees action in the siege of Coriolis, a Volscian town, where he single-handedly stops a Roman rout, enters the town, opens its gates to his forces, and leads a cohort of soldiers to relieve the remaining Romans in the field. For these feats of valor, he will accept as reward only the surname Coriolanus. On his return, the Roman nobles persuade Coriolanus to stand for consul, the highest elected office in Rome. For this, he needs the support of the people, which he grudgingly demands in the marketplace, though he does not follow the custom of showing his scars to prove his military service. The people support him at first, but his half-hearted politicking allows the tribunes who lead the people to persuade the people to withdraw their support. Their about-face enrages Coriolanus, who has always sided with the nobles against the people. He explodes with a speech full of disgust and contempt for the people. The tribunes accuse him of treason, and he is banished from Rome. The exiled Coriolanus heads for the Volscian city of Antium to the house of the enemy general Aufidius, of whom he says, "Were I anything but what I am, I would wish me only he." He persuades Aufidius to share command of the Volscian army so that Coriolanus can take revenge on Rome. Coriolanus keeps his word. He leads the Volscians to the gates of Rome and is about to sack the city when an embassy by his wife, his mother, and his young son persuades him instead to make peace between the warring peoples. Coriolanus' exile is lifted by a grateful Roman people, but he accompanies Aufidius back to Antium, where Aufidius publicly accuses Coriolanus again of treason. And before the appalled eyes of the Volscian nobles and to the approving howls of the people, he has Coriolanus hacked to pieces. Now, the circumstances of this tragedy seem to support Huntington's verdict. In Republican Rome, there is no institutional cleavage between civilian and military spheres. Military heroes can become politicians without resigning their commissions. Politicians routinely serve as generals. The Roman military lacks corporateness. It also lacks expertise. The Republic prizes the application of violence more than its management, and virtue, not knowledge, occupies the Roman military mind. The deepest cleavage in Rome is social, between the nobles and the people. The nobles provide the military officers, the people the rank and file, and all soldiers remain partisans of their social class. So there is a kind of responsibility, but a kind only compatible with subjective control. Objective control and military professionalism in Huntington's sense are unknown in Rome. And yet, the hacked corpse of Coriolanus argues it is dead wrong to say there is no civil-military tension in the Roman Republic. What then is this tension, and what light does it shed on modern problems? In Shakespeare's view, this tension is between two ways of life, which his language encourages us to call the way of words and the way of blows. His Coriolanus aspires perfectly to embody the way of blows. Shakespeare follows Plutarch in ascribing to his Republican Romans the view that courage is the whole of virtue. By courage, they mean the ability to endure the fear of death and the pain that threatens death. Courage in this sense makes soldiers able to risk their lives for Rome because they can endure the imaginary and real pains that come with this risk. It also makes them disdain lying, either by telling falsehoods or by breaking promises. On this view, we tell lies only because we fear the pain that comes with telling the truth. But it is fear and pain that the courageous pride themselves on enduring. No one who is strong enough to risk his very life in battle will ever be so weak as to lie. In seeking to follow perfectly the way of blows, Coriolanus takes endurance of pain and disdain for lies so far as to conclude that he can neither accept reward nor accept praise for his services. To take a reward for risking one's life is to imply that one runs the risk only to get the reward. This turns virtuous endurance into cool-headed calculation and a patriotic soldier into a mercenary. It casts doubt on the possibility of true self-sacrifice. To accept praise for one's valor amounts to the same thing. It implies that praise is valor's price and goal, that words are an adequate recompense for blows. Coriolanus, who bears 24 wounds for his country, cannot bear to hear his deeds praised. I had rather have one scratch my head in the sun when the alarm were struck, he says, than idly sit to hear my nothings monstered. This is why Coriolanus will not show his scars to the people and can scarcely beg their support for his consulship. he will not make his wounds, nor the deeds that earned them, the price of political success. Now, Shakespeare shows us several images of where Coriolanus' path, the way of blows, ends up. Its perfection is a solitary warrior who does not fear death, who feels no pain, who needs neither praise nor reward. Its perfection is a killing machine. The senator and general Cominius reports Coriolanus' valor against the Volscians thus: "From face to foot he was a thing of blood, whose every motion was timed with dying cries." Later, when Coriolanus returns from exile at the head of the Volscian army, his general Cominius imagines him thus: "He is their god. He leads them like a thing made by some other deity than nature, that shapes man better." Later still, when the senator Menenius fails to persuade Coriolanus to spare Rome, he reports, "When he walks, he moves like an engine and the ground shrinks before his treading. He is able to pierce a corslet with his eye, talks like a knell, and his hum is a battery. He wants nothing of a god but eternity and a heaven to throne in." Now, not every Roman soldier goes as far in the way of blows as Coriolanus. Amusingly, Cominius, the general, has to explain to an uncomprehending Coriolanus on the battlefield that a retreat can sometimes be good tactics. Less amusingly, he also tries and fails to persuade Coriolanus that it is wise to accept public praise. In a painful scene, Coriolanus' mother, Volumnia, tries and half succeeds in persuading him that because it is good to lie in enemies in battle, it is sometimes also good to lie to fellow citizens in peacetime. Her half-success leads Coriolanus to his grudging final appeal to the Roman people for support, and so sets the stage for his banishment. But such half-hearted combinations of the ways of words and blows are notable mostly for their ineffectiveness. Their mixtures are not solutions to the problem Coriolanus' purity reveals: the deep natural antagonism between the military way of blows and the civilian way of words. The way of words involves the pursuit not of virtue but of advantage. It orients itself by how one treats fellow citizens in political life, rather than by how one treats enemies on the battlefield. In Shakespeare's play, we see its importance from the very beginning. In the first scene, the Roman people demand more food and less debt from the nobles in return for their military service. And the nobleman Menenius pacifies them with a story comparing the Senate to a stomach and the people to the body's members, who eventually will benefit from everything the Senate takes in. A citizen later exposes the quid pro quo at the heart of the way of words when he tells Coriolanus, who is soliciting the people's support in the marketplace, "You must think if we give you anything, we hope to gain by you. To die for one's country from this perspective is a quid without a quo, a misfortune, if not a stupidity. To risk one's life for one's country is a matter not of virtue, but of calculation." This is a way of words because the political pursuit of advantage requires endless lying. Menenius' fable of the stomach and the members is an exemplary political lie. It pacifies the rebellious people despite the Senate's clear failure to distribute food to its so-called members, and despite its clear willingness to strangle these members with usury or to cut them off in Rome's wars. The nobles of Rome, no less than the people, pursue in politics their particular advantage. Unlike the way of blows, the way of words traffics in rewards and praise, and is perfected in the smooth commerce of fellow citizens, bound together by fear, mutual need, and the hope for advantage. When Coriolanus confronts the truth of the way of words, he is enraged and disgusted. Because it undermines and devalues his warrior virtues, he sees nothing in it but defeat, decay, and death. The heart of Rome is vicious politics, but only Coriolanus' virtues, his virtuous dedication to Rome, make him more than a politician. So, what light do these sketches of the ways of words and blows and of the natural antagonism between them shed on modern problems? Modern theorists of civil-military relations grant there is something distinctive about the military way of life, but hesitate to investigate it. Huntington, for example, refers to the officer's technical love for his craft, to his sense of social obligation, and to his ideal of service to the nation. But he does not ask what is particularly lovable about the military craft, nor why the soldier in particular should feel obligated to benefit society or to serve the nation. Peter Fever numbers among the preferences of a military agent a general preference for honor or a desire for respect, the satisfaction of which founds the crucial subordination of the military to civilians, and which must be distinguished from a preference for glory or a desire for distinction. But he too does not ask how honor differs from glory, or how respect differs from distinction, or whether civilians can or even should satisfy this military preference. Shakespeare's Coriolanus depicts with unflinching clarity the logic of the way of blows and its antagonism with the logic of the way of words. Any military, to the extent that it is authorized to risk and take human life, will to that extent be open to the logic of the way of blows, and to that extent open to its critique of the way of words. Modern innovations like military professionalism and objective control, innovations that separate the civilian and the military spheres, can disguise the tension between these two ways of life. They can also make military responses to this tension less likely, avoiding various kinds of shirking that at the limit can become, as in the case of Coriolanus, a defection or a coup. But they cannot dispel this tension, because these ways of life give incompatible answers to the same fundamental questions. Future innovations like remote or autonomous weapons or biotechnological enhancements that make soldiers more like Coriolanus' mechanical ideal may further distance those who take life from those who risk it, but they will not dissolve the natural antagonism of both with those who do neither. Huntington may be mistaken about the profit we can take from studying civil-military relations in the great books of the Western tradition. But the logic of the way of blows, as it is depicted in Shakespeare's Coriolanus, argues that Huntington is right to see a tendency towards objective control in the military way of life. Coriolanus does not want to be consul. He does not want to sully himself with the way of words. He wants to be a machine, and a machine is an instrument. Since the tragic logic of civil-military relations draws its bloody consequences in Shakespeare's play, when the ways of words and blows take their purest forms, policymakers can learn from this tragedy to dilute the purity of these ways. On the military side, the logic of the way of blows can be diffused by teaching warriors moral virtues other than courage, particularly the social virtue of justice, and by critiquing these moral virtues so as to point to the intellectual virtues. On the civilian side, the logic of the way of words can be disguised by limiting the appearance of inequality in the society that the military is sworn to protect, which means limiting the actual inequality between the classes of that society. And between these two sides, we should cultivate a thoughtful Huntingtonian professionalism to keep the ways of words and blows in separate institutional spheres. But we cannot hope for too much from these strategies. However much he wishes to become a machine, Coriolanus remains a man. He was born, not made, and this brute fact keeps him from becoming the instrument of his own vengeance against Rome. The logic of Coriolanus' way of life forces him into a tragic confrontation with the only body that can justify this way of life, the city that he can neither live with nor live without. There is a world elsewhere, but he never makes it more than a day's march from Rome. Thanks.
Okay, we have a fair amount of time left for questions, comments from the audience. Yes, sir.
Regan, this one's aimed at you.
Yeah.
a very interesting discussion about the evolution of armament for police departments. But you left out one critical area. When we in the military look at, say, getting a new weapon, spend a lot of time studying the threat. What is the enemy armor? And I'd offer to you, you improved that presentation tremendously by considering that today's police officer walking a beat or in his car is faced with an organized gang with MAC-10s, with firepower like a military unit. And I'd offer that perhaps the reason some little town in Connecticut chose to arm itself is the knowledge that those gangs aren't far away and they're spread. It's just a consideration of what I thought was a great presentation.
Thank you, and that's certainly an important point. And I think the general perception is as you describe, and there certainly are instances in which that's the case, but the data indicate that still upwards of 90% of violent crime is committed by people with handguns. Right? So we do have the sort of incidents where we have what look to be militarized criminal forces, gangs and the like. And they certainly get a lot of attention for obvious reasons. It's not clear the extent to which they represent a trend. With the ubiquitous of media nowadays, you know, we can maybe sometimes gain impressions that aren't completely accurate. But your point is certainly a fair one. I think what may be even more important, though, is the perception on the part of local police forces that that's the world they live in. Whether that corresponds with the day-to-day threats that they face or not, certainly their perception, I think, is what animates this sort of arms race, right? And I think, you know, we have to think about not only the material effects of that, but the sort of the psychological effects of that, the way in which police officers see themselves. So to the extent that they see themselves under siege, you know, they'll respond in an equivalent way, right? So that's something I think it would be good to get more information on. I agree, but I think, you know, this is a world also in which perceptions can be as important as the actual truth on the ground. Thank you for your comment. Jess?
I have two questions actually. One to you, Mitch, about, I was wondering whether, well, 2 points. One is that what's interesting about the militarization of the police is that here it doesn't seem that the threat is similar to the threat that the founders were worried about, which is that a professional military force would take over the government. Here, the militarization of the police is actually in some ways operating as a threat to communities, and particularly disadvantaged groups and communities. But I was wondering whether you think there's a link between narrative military metaphors, for example, the war against drugs, and the way terrorism narratives operated to enable that militarization. So I know at least one small town that's mentioned, I forget which one, the way they applied for one of their MRAPs was by positing the possibility of a threat to their annual pumpkin festival, a terrorist threat to their annual pumpkin festival, as a reason for having this weapon. I'm not making that
That's where I would strike.
Right, exactly. So I'm just wondering if there's a link between the languages in which these threats are classed and the militarization of the police. I did have a second, I have a second question.
Okay, fine. I'll take that on. Thank you. Yes, I very much agree that's the case. Many people trace, you know, the emergence of this trend with the rhetoric of the war on drugs. And indeed, for a certain period, and with the inception of the program that I described, it was confined to drug interdiction programs, eventually expanded somewhat. But there is, you know, an inclination, again, to borrow from the military the sort of language in a kind of an unreflective, again, kind of way, and to think that it's the application of violence that is really what is necessary to subdue these sorts of threats. And again, going back to Mr. Fallow's presentation, I think to some degree that reflects, you know, on the one hand, sort of an idealization of the military, a sort of uncritical perspective, without an appreciation, really, of the experience of the military and the orientation that it brings to violence and how seriously it regards it. On the first point you mentioned, yes, I think the concern, to the extent the founders were concerned that someone in power would employ the military, in a sense, to take over the government and a coup, the police don't represent that. But I think the deeper concern was that the state, if you will, represented by the British Crown at that time, would be able to use those who were authorized to employ violence to undermine the liberties of ordinary citizens, right? And to the extent, and I think it's still an open question, but to the extent that we see the trend I've described gathering momentum, it really is on the everyday level that people's civil liberties are most affected by the local police. Certainly not the professional military, not the National Guard, right? It's those day-to-day encounters with the police that have a profound effect on our scope of sense of liberty. So again, I mean, I have great admiration for the police, and I know that there are many police forces that take different sorts of philosophies, but this does seem to be a trajectory that's gaining momentum. You can ask your second question since there's another handout.
This is all three of you. While I was listening, I was thinking, I wonder whether there's a bit of a tension between a moralized conception of the military. So sort of rationalizations used in serving an important moral good, sometimes the idea of, the idea of military officer possessing certain virtues. Do you think there's a tension between that conception of the military and subordination to the civilian government? Because there could clearly, as have been cases of the civilian government wants to use military for purposes that are dishonorable, immoral, and so forth. So how would the military reconcile, well, how would that kind of moralized conception of the military be reconciled with that subordination to the government in those cases?
I can take the first stab if you want. Kind of speaking, I think is from Plato's perspective. I don't think saying that a military officer or guardian or however you identify it is identified with certain virtues necessarily implies that they have the whole of virtue or even the highest virtues, right? It may be that that there's a kind of trustworthiness, a kind of courage, but that this is understood to not be the peak experience that human beings are capable of, or the peak character, right? And so I think that's how he would think about the problem, is that there's a set of virtues, but whatever it is that civilian leaders ideally have, right? Prudence, statesmanship, something like that, right, could be understood to be more important than the virtues that are identified in military officers.
Yeah, in Plutarch's presentation of Coriolanus, and Shakespeare follows him in this, it's a particular characteristic of the Roman understanding of virtue, that courage is highlighted and is understood to be the whole of virtue. That said, I don't think the problem is simply reducible, right? In other words, if there's a kind of excellence in the military that's prized, and then the civilians mean to use that excellence for some end that undermines it, I think you have a difficult situation. Right? It can be concealed, I think, but it's there.
Ed?
Well, just a comment, mainly to you, but you others might want to comment too. I'm thinking about the chapter where Hunting talks about the military mind, the fact that functional imperatives kind of select for and impart certain qualities to the military. I'm wondering, though, whether liberal democratic societies have changed what we see in military culture. In other words, we have these structural, institutional solutions to the civil problem that is based in human nature traditionally, and the educational one. But education includes the society's culture more generally. In liberal democratic societies, the degree of respect for human rights seems to form people in a certain way. So by the time they get to your academy, they don't need too much education to be the way we want them to be, for civil military relations to be the way we want them. So I guess comment on that. Do you think liberal democracy has changed things?
Yeah, I can say something about that. First, I think I disagree with the conclusion that you drew, that there's not much to do in the case of education, just because they've come out of the society that's going to be governing their use, right? Because there's no guarantee that what they've come out of has been particularly thoughtful on this question. But yeah, I mean, the clear differences with something like Coriolanus's case are that our military comes out of civilian life and expects to return to civilian life, right? And so it wouldn't surprise me if this means that something of the liberal democratic commercial, let's say, thinking has to pervade the military, is going to come into the military at the recruitment end, and there's going to be some eye to another way of life when they leave the military as well. And that, from my perspective, is going to complicate things. It poses a problem for education and not a solution.
And so, so to speak to that, and this is purely anecdotal in all of this, but I've taught this course at Samuel at West Point now, and this semester at Harvard. And there's a really interesting difference between the way that the two groups of students react to this military mind. But my West Point students tend to be very resistant to it because I think most of them come in understanding their military service and leave often too as being in service of some broad humanitarian ideal that ennobles it, right? And rightly, but that's different than Huntington's notion of the conservative mind. The Harvard students, on the other hand, are quite willing to believe that about the military, right? That the profession kind of favors a mentality that sees war as a permanent thing, that puts national interests front and center, all of this sort of thing. So I don't know whether it's the case that kind of time in the profession is what allows Huntington's characteristics of military mind to emerge insofar as they do. But that might be part of the way to explain what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I think also, it's easy to, to criticize Huntington's notions, something so broad to characterize an entire group of people in that way. I do think, to some degree, maybe at least historically, the way I've seen it is as what I would describe as sort of a Burkean corrective to the liberal democratic narrative of relentless progress and possibility of human perfectibility, right? And a certain sort of faith in that, and a certain faith in reason, in eventually, increasing our enlightenment in some way, right? And I think, to some degree, what Huntington says is, well, the way he characterizes it, the military is a bit more skeptical about human nature, less willing to take things on faith, more accustomed to dealing with the darker side of human nature. And, now Huntington, valorizes and idealizes that as, really what the rest of society ought to adopt. And I'm not sure that's the case, but I do think that there's a role, maybe it would not necessarily be the military, but I think there needs to be some aspect of society that does provide something of a corrective to that. And so in that respect, what he says about the military mind, if you could sort of generalize it more beyond that, to me, does seem to me something that continues to be of value. What I would describe as sort of a cultural conservatism, not in the sense of, they're saying in a Burkean sense, in the belief that, that institutions have persisted for a reason, that radical change, should be somewhat suspect in the name of, greater enlightenment, that sort of thing, and the fallibility of human nature. Yes, sir.
In the military, we sign up with the knowledge and acceptance that we may be asked to give our lives for our country. And we are outfitted with the tools necessary to do our jobs and hopefully come back safely. Do you happen to know if this is the same on the civilian side with the police? And if so, what would be an appropriate level of preparation for them home safely?
I certainly think police are aware of that same possibility, and I think the people who serve, take that on, knowing that that's a possibility. In that sense, I have great respect for them. I don't know enough about police training methods to get to comment on the extent to which there is the same, what I would describe as sort of very conscientious sort of instruction on the use of violence as there is in the military. I suspect it varies considerably, right? But I think also for, you know, the police person, I mean, the sort of the traditional kind of iconic image is the policeman on the beat, right? Who is not there simply as a sentry, right? But who's someone who's engaging with the community, who understands the community's concerns and interests, and who also obviously gathers useful intelligence, so to speak, while doing that, right? And I think there are some police forces that have had some success. It's called community policing, and I'm sure, like anything else, you know, things rise and fall in fashion, you know. So what I would hope is that that awareness of the possibility of having to give your life, right, is leavened to some degree by an appreciation of the fact that you're kind of part of the fabric of the community. And I'm sure it's a difficult balance to strike, and I could see how you'd go sort of to one extreme, if you will. So.
Yeah, just to add to that, one of the problems that comes up early in Plato's Republic is they're building this imaginary city on the principle one person, one job, and they want to know how the same person can both be a soldier in the sense of being harsh to enemies and a policeman in the sense of being kind or gentle to friends, right? They think that that's two different natures. It would be interesting to see what the discourse about courage is in our police forces, whether they speak about courage in a military way or whether there's a clear distinction.
Yes, let's get Marina in the conversation.
All right. So if I could add a couple points and I'll end in a question. And it gets at your hypothesis of the militarization of police. I'm curious if in your research there was any correlation. Obviously, I think that the reason they acquired a lot of the military gear they did, and MRAPs particularly, and some of the weapons, was because after 15 years of war, we had quite a surplus of that when we pulled out of Afghanistan, and then, or Iraq first, then Afghanistan. I sense that the police forces could get that equipment on the cheap, and that with the rise, as the gentleman brought up, with the rise of the terrorist threat, the active shooter scenarios, MS-13, gang proliferation, et cetera, and gangs being more organized in a paramilitary fashion, certainly the police departments don't want to be unprepared, which no one can blame them for that. But I would also bring up the point, and I would be interested in your thoughts if you saw this in the research or not, as to the perception that police are actually being more scrutinized for when they draw a weapon and when they shoot what's later found out to be an unarmed civilian, even if that unarmed individual had a knife or a cell phone that looked like a gun or whatever, and they're making light of that situation so they can go home at the end of the day to their families, and they're being that much more scrutinized for it. And now with the proliferation of body cams, are body cams going to be the guardian of the guardians of the future, and not just for police, but for our military? I see that potentially coming into play down the road. And so I guess to close and to end with a question more, is that where we're headed? You mentioned the darker side of human nature, and with the wielding and or managing violence, whether it's as a military service member or as a police officer. Are we no longer operating on our own virtue, or are we going to have body cams and drones watching everything we do, responsible for what we do?
Yes, well, that's a great question. I think, you know, I haven't certainly seen any firm data that discuss the extent to which there may have been overuse of violence that's in some way correlated with this increase in use of military weapons and tactics. I will say, you know, going back to the gentleman's earlier question, there is certainly perception of the militarization of the criminals, if you will. But you know, this trajectory has had its own independent kind of momentum, and it's not necessarily correlated with that. And maybe we're in an arms race, you know, at this point. But I think it's a really excellent question about, you know, being under scrutiny, because I think we're seeing that with the military as well. You know, I mean, We live in an era in which, social media is ubiquitous, right? And for every drone strike in which people did the appropriate collateral damage estimate, right? Nonetheless, there will be civilians who are casualties, right? And that creates some real challenges. It's sort of reminiscent, I guess, of what General Krulak talked about with the concept of the strategic corporal. That is, what people do on a tactical level nowadays can have immense political ramifications, right? And so I think that's a really difficult balance that we're trying to figure out how to live with. I mean, some of you may have seen Eye in the Sky, the more recent movie about the drone, right? Well, so the concern there with the young girl being a casualty of the drone strike is not whether it's legally permissible, right? That's clear, right? It's whether politically, as those people are sitting around around that conference room, whether politically it's going to be problematic for her to die, right? Even though you've got, major high-value targets with suicide vests that are going out, to detonate them. So, I don't have a clean answer for that, but I think that's an element not only of modern policing, but of modern warfare that is really complicating things a lot.
To speak briefly to that too, I think the kind of worry about body cams and this intrusive monitoring comes from like a good, respectable Huntingtonian kind of worry, right? That if we monitor people so intrusively, we aren't really treating them as professionals, right? Who can kind of monitor themselves, do the right thing, be virtuous in themselves. I think to some degree, though, that kind of distinction between objective control and subjective control, right? Between like monitoring and punishing versus allowing people to be autonomous, is sometimes overdrawn. And I think that you can still believe in professionals who are autonomous and capable of doing the right thing on their own, and hold that when they do step over a line, they have to be punished for that, right? You see this in Huntington, for instance. He doesn't want to stress that, but he's definitely on Truman's side against MacArthur, right? He's very clear about that. So that's something like monitoring. It's something like punishment. It looks a bit like subjective control. It's just kept way outside of the place where it would interfere with professional autonomy. So I think that's the way I would worry about body cams, right? Is it the kind of monitoring that's consistent with the degree of autonomy, or is it the sort of monitoring that you would expect just because no profession should be ever set totally on its own to do its own thing?
Thank you. Yeah, unfortunately, we're going to have to stop the conversation because Kathleen Hicks is going to be here. So we're going to break until 2:30, and please be back in your seats at 2:30. And thank you, panel. That was extremely insightful and helpful.